בסדר, רגע שנייה. כן, שמה.
Okay, so thank you for joining us. The free market has won. From the USSR to Venezuela, planned economies have openly and with tragic consequences failed. Yet, despite the obvious victory of capitalism on the economic battlefield, the free market is suffering badly on the field of public opinion. From Occupy Wall Street in the US to the tent protest here on Rothschild, many of the elite and the masses call for more and more government intervention and planning. With us today, Dr. Sarah Squire and Professor Stephen Horovitz. Dr. Squire is a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund and literary editor at the Foundation for Economic Education. Correct? Mm-hmm. Professor Horovitz is a senior scholar at the George Mason University, George Mason University's Mercatus Center and distinguished professor of the free enterprise at Ball State University. Both of them speak often, and their writing can be found in a variety of places, including Bleeding Heart Libertarian. They are joining us today to discuss with us how we talk about economics and the free market, the challenges in advocating liberty, and how to use non-economic argument and language to make the best case for free market. Please help me to welcome Dr. Squire and Professor Horovitz.
Yes, thank you indeed for having us. We've been at Kohelet this morning. This is my first time in Israel, Sarah's second, and we're really, really delighted to be here. I'll say one more thing and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. What we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation. We're going to go back and forth and tag team it. And I think that introduction described pretty accurately what we're going to do. And the other one thing I'll add is we were just talking about the book you guys have put out with all the op-eds and newspaper articles in it. And that's a really good example of some of the kinds of things that we're going to talk about today. So that's a good sign.
Yeah, do we want to, I think small enough group, we could probably, if people have questions as we go, just throw your hand up if you have questions or want clarifications or...
And we'll certainly leave time at the end.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about Steve's and my work is that the work that we do has kind of flown out of the people who we are. Our backgrounds, in other words, and the kinds of education that we have were very, very different. And when we got to know each other, when we got to be friends, we discovered a lot of sort of common interests and things that we wanted to work on, but we came at them from completely different angles and found that that could be incredibly productive. And so this talk is going to start with a little bit of personal history, not too much. But it's important to know, for example, that my background is in English literature. I have a PhD from the University of Chicago. I wrote on 17th century English literature. Shakespeare, John Donne, George Herbert, John Milton, the geekiest possible English literature out there. I never took a class in economics as an undergraduate or in high school. I went to a small liberal arts college, in large part because they weren't going to make me take math as an undergraduate, because I avoid it like the plague. And I thought for a very long time that, not that economics wasn't important, I knew it was important, but I thought that I wasn't going to be able to understand it because clearly it had to be done mathematically, right? It had to be approached through numbers and through graphs. And it just wasn't going to be my kind of thing. So I was more or less there when I started working for Liberty Fund, which works a lot on history and on literature and on theology, but also does a lot of work in economics. And so my task when I began that job was to learn how to hang out with economists. And I discovered the best way to hang out with economists is to hand the economist a drink and say, I don't know anything about economics. What do you think the most important thing I need to know is?
And which drink you gave them.
Well, yeah. But it turned out to be a really good way to start hanging out with economists, Steve among them, and to learn a lot of economists. So to this day, when people ask me sort of what I do, I tend to say I'm not an economist, but I drink with economists, right? I spend a lot of time drinking with them. And that's kind of where Steve's half enters the picture.
I like to say she learned economics on the street,
Yeah.
which is not.
Might not mean the same thing.
No, I know, yes. Learned it unofficially in back alleys and places like that. So I'm the reverse, right? I'm an economist. My undergraduate degrees, I have 2 in economics and philosophy. The majority of courses I took as an undergraduate were econ, philosophy, and some political science. Took a little bit of history. I never took a literature course, never took an art course. To the degree I dabbled in that stuff, it was through an honors great books program I took in my first year, but I never had an interest in any of that stuff. And I still think to this day it's a sort of big gap, big hole in my sort of knowledge of the world that I don't know it better. Now, I hang out with a literature person a lot now, right? So I've learned some things, but I didn't even, I didn't have a kind of job that had a reason for me to do what she did, like hand the lit people to drink and say, tell me about what you think the greatest work of literature. So I never had that experience. Most of what I've learned about literature and about the humanities in general has either been through a little bit of work of my own, but mostly through the work that Sarah and I have done together. So put this in another way, we had to learn how to talk to each other, both sort of the 2 of us literally, but also other people in each other's discipline. She had to learn to talk to the economists. I taught at a liberal arts college for 27, 28 years, and I had to learn how to talk to my colleagues in English and art history and all those kind of places too. So all of that together explains sort of where we came from and how we, what the problem that we had to navigate.
Yeah, we accidentally got married to each other along the way in there too.
Yeah, and so navigating that problem and figuring out how that was a metaphor in some ways or an example of a bigger problem about how economists in particular communicate with the broader world.
Right, and so what we discovered as a result of starting to work together and learning how to talk to each other about the kinds of work that we were doing and the kinds of questions that we thought were interesting, the kinds of answers that we were coming up with. We discovered that there were enormous gains from trade to be had for talking between the 2 disciplines. And we found that there were a lot of challenges that were present when we tried to do that as well, both in sort of individually in me saying, wait, you have to take that apart and tell me that again, because I don't understand I understand what you think you said, but I don't understand how you got there, or what the heck actually you did just say. Or I would say something to Steve or hand him, I'd say, oh, Shakespeare says exactly that same thing here, and he'd read it and would go, I need translation, because I got nothing. I don't even just understand what the sentences are. So we found these stumbling blocks on an individual level, but also on a larger disciplinary level, right? There are plenty of economists, plenty of folks in sort of movement for free markets who reject literature pretty much out of hand for being, on the whole, anti-market, for being anti-trade, for being, in general, Marxist, and all of the things that I'm guessing most of the folks who are here in this room don't want. Right? And so they just feel like they don't need to attend to it.
Yeah, I don't need to read Shakespeare because I know The Merchant of Venice is anti-capitalist.
Right, and that's kind of where they get. Or for economists who are a little bit more interested in literature, they'll read along until they find maybe a little bit that says something about money or about markets and kind of grab that as the main message of the book and then, discard the rest. This drives English departments crazy. And is a real problem. And then you can complain about me now.
Well, there's all kinds of things we can complain about. But I think the biggest problem, I think Sarah identified it in her own experience, right? Which is people from, say, the English department believe it's all economics is numbers and graphs and stuff like that. They also have this sort of belief that it's all rational choice in the strictest, narrowest sense of the term. It's not real people who you're talking about. They also, of course, have all the usual anti-capitalist, many of them have many of the usual anti-capitalist biases. So for them, learning economics economics is the defense of capitalism. Therefore, why do I want to learn economics? Because I know capitalism is wrong, and so on. Right. So part of breaking that conversation down is how do we get beyond that?
Right. So what we want to do is talk about some of the stumbling blocks that we ran into on our journey there, and then finish up with talking about what the gains from trade are, in hopes of encouraging folks to take a stab at this kind of communication and see how it works. So the first real stumbling block we ran into was, as I said, figuring out what the heck the other person was talking about. And this is because economists don't use words like normal people do. I don't know if you guys know this. I'm suspecting it's probably the same in Hebrew as it is in English. But what I have found is that economists use words that ordinary human beings use every day to mean something completely different from what they mean when they say them, and it results in complete lack of understanding and often an opposite understanding from what economists are trying to communicate. So, like the word optimal, when Steve says optimal, you mean?
The best thing possible under the given constraints of cost.
Right, that's
Good.
good solid definition of optimal. Economists in the room are nodding. When ordinary human beings hear optimal, they think that means, yay, the best possible thing, the best thing. We're on board with it. And so one of the first debates Steve and I engaged in, you remember, on Facebook. So Steve had asked his Facebook, there had just been a big hurricane.
There was a tsunami.
There was a tsunami, right? And Steve asked his Facebook page, what's the optimal number of buildings to be destroyed during a tsunami?
Or an earthquake.
Right? And I said, well, okay, this is why you guys don't get invited to the really good parties. Because you ask questions like that. Because when a normal person reads that question, they think you're in favor of buildings being destroyed during a tsunami. They think that you guys watch buildings fall down and cheer and are excited and think it would be great for buildings to fall down. It's completely the opposite of what you actually mean.
Well, mostly. It's not that we cheer, right? But we recognize that there's trade-offs and there's costs, right? So just with that example, we could build buildings so that they're safe from a 9.0 earthquake. We can do it. We have this resources and technology. But what's the opportunity cost, right? What are we giving up if we devote resources to doing that, right? We're not devoting resources to curing childhood cancer, to any number of things we might do, which means that there's lives being lost over there if we devote resources here. So the question we always say, economists want to answer is, how do we make these allocation decisions? How do we decide where resources are going to go? And it might well make more sense to devote fewer resources to earthquake protection and devote more resources to curing AIDS or cancer or any of the other, heart disease, of a million things we can think about. That doesn't mean we're cheering, right, when the buildings fall, but it does mean we just recognize that we live in a world of scarcity and we have to make choices, and those choices have costs, and we can't. There's no free lunch, right? We can't get everything that we want.
But the problem with using the word optimal, when you're particularly, like if you're speaking to a group of, non-economists or writing in the press, the problem with using the word optimal in a context like that is people stop listening and they don't get to the subtleties of that kind of argument about opportunity costs and about trade-offs.
Right, and especially if you say something like, in an earthquake, what's the optimal number of dead babies, right? That's really
right. And
get you to any parties at all,
right,
much less
and
the good ones.
We hear economists say that kind of thing all of the time. How about efficient? Efficient is another good one, because this is one I really had to learn. I knew going in, actually, I picked up fairly quickly. I didn't really know what economists meant by optimal, but I knew they couldn't possibly mean what I thought they meant. But efficient took me a very long time to figure out the difference, because it's very subtle. When I say efficient, I mean fast, right? I want my daughters to be efficient about getting ready for school in the morning. I want them dressed, breakfasted, and on the bus as rapidly as possible. That's not...
It's not exactly what we mean. It's not necessarily about fast. It's about the idea of, is it worth it, right? Are you acting in a way that's worth the cost? By the way, our wedding rings are inscribed on the inside with MB greater than MC. Right, so those of you economists might know marginal benefits greater than marginal costs, because we're romantic that way. Which is basically what we mean by efficient, right? Which is it was her idea. It shows how far I got it. Right?
Yeah.
So efficient is not just fast, right? I mean, if you try to load the dishwasher as quickly as possible, you might be more likely to break plates or drop stuff and things like that. So the question is, how do you get the task done at the least cost? Right? And that's, again, when we talk about efficiency, that's more or less what we mean. It doesn't just, it can mean fast. I mean, even your getting ready for school example, right, might work, although you might think, well, they're going to run up and down the stairs and they're more likely to trip and fall. That's right. So, right, you can play with it a bit, but efficient basically means, is it worth it? And the answer is yes, and that's efficient.
Right. But when you're talking about economic policy and you say efficient, right, and you're asking the question, is it worth it? And people just think it means we need to get it done as rapidly as possible.
Right, so
you can see where the misunderstanding comes in, right? Or if people say they want a more efficient market.
or a more efficient school system.
Right. They don't, apparently you don't mean you want the market to go faster or you want kids to move through school more rapidly. But I think that's what a lot of people hear, right? And again, I think that what happens is economists aren't aware that some of these terms are heard so differently outside of their discipline. And so they can't understand why people stop listening before they get to the good part of the argument, right?
Yes.
So cost is another good one. Or do we want to do margins first?
We'll say margins first. Cost, so what's the problem with cost? Seems clear enough to me.
So, well, this is interesting, right? Because this is people think that economists don't, have much heart, right? I'm sorry, probably just popped the mic when I did that.
It's all the dead babies.
Right, that they think that economists aren't sort of emotional and warm and fuzzy creatures, right? But what's interesting is when you talk about cost to most people outside of economics, they think, how much did I spend on something, right? What did the gallon of milk cost at the store this morning, right? What's the cost of, the new car that I want, right? And you guys think of it in a much more complicated and much more interesting way.
Right. Cost is, think in terms of opportunity cost, it's the next best alternative you gave up, right? Where you think about the subjective nature of cost, right? We decide what counts as a cost, and cost is always perceived as the perception that the chooser has about what that cost is. Might be money, might not, right? So, I might turn down a really lucrative job because it means working for a cigarette company and I object to that morally, right? And that counts as a cost, right? So all those things count as costs. And people say economists know the price of everything but the cost of nothing. Well, actually, if anything, it's the opposite, right? Right? We know we in terms of cost, we include everything in that notion of cost, and that is often, I think, Sarah's got a point, right? We often don't communicate that idea very well. And those of you who know the economics, right, this goes back to Bastiat and the seen and the unseen, right, up to the Austrian tradition and other places where we recognize that cost is subjective and covers a whole wide range of things that are the things we give up to do what we want.
Right, and so again, if you're talking about policies or if you're talking about the kinds of choices that people make, when an economist says we can't implement that policy, it costs too much, people think that just means you don't want to spend that kind of money on something instead of thinking opportunity cost, time cost.
Right, and it's interesting because that's the right way to frame the how many buildings in a earthquake thing, right? Is to say, is it worth it? Is it efficient? What's the cost, right? That's what we're emphasizing. It's not worth it. It's not worth the cost in all kinds of ways, right? Especially in terms of what else could we do with the resources to make buildings safe from a 9/11 earthquake.
If you say it that way, people hear that you don't want to spend the money to protect people from the earthquake.
Right, which is why you got to talk about literally what the opportunity cost is.
When I talk to somebody about cost, I always try not to talk about money at all.
Good.
I'm talking about time usually.
Yeah, that's.
I said you need to, in order to have good time here, you will have to suffer somewhere else.
Yep.
Doing a job or something. And you have to always, when you talk about cost, the smartest thing is to put it on a plain field.
Yep.
Everything the same.
That's right.
But money, people don't like it to be a money.
Right.
So time is, I think,
Yeah.
it's
And we all understand that that's limited, and we have to make
Yeah.
choices, and we can't do all the things we want to do. Yeah, that's great.
Right, we seem to think that money, or at least government money, is kind of an unlimited resource and we can just keep like generating it from somewhere and paying for things, right? But time, generally human beings have a pretty good sense of, you know, finite lifespan. At least once you're over about like what, 20,
Yeah, right.
24.
Teenagers.
Kind of hits.
you have to sleep as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
You should.
And Steve gave a talk this morning at Kahela where he was talking about the price of consumer goods changing over time and converted the price into the number of hours it takes to buy the object.
At an average, sort of an average wage, right? How many hours you have to work to buy the thing, and that number's come way down over the last number of time.
So yeah, time is a great way to talk about cost. Marginal, right? So in my world, right, on the margin means over here or over here. It's where we put the stuff that's not important, right? It's like shoved over on the side where it doesn't matter. That's what on the margin means. Except that on the margin.
Except it doesn't, right? Right, when economists, of course, talk about the margin, right? Where the similarity is we're talking about the edge, right? We're talking about the next thing, right? So the edge of the paper is the margin, right? So you are faced with a decision. What we say when we use that word margin or marginal, what we're saying is what are the costs and benefits of your next step, right? Of your next choice. We're not talking about what you've done already or anything like that. And so that's how we're using the term, and you know, for us, it has that kind of technical meaning, but that's a really important one, right? If you understand that concept of the margin, that's really useful. And it ties into all these things about choice and efficiency.
In Hebrew, it's force.
Yeah.
It's not important.
It's in something that doesn't import it. It's so small that doesn't import it.
Yeah, we, in English, marginal consideration is sort of a trivial thing you can basically ignore.
Yeah, that's one of the
Right.
meanings in English.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So
Huge problem.
Right. Right. So
Huge problem.
and this is a tricky one to get out of, right? I mean, it's, you know, there's no, even in the early economists who wrote about margin, right? When Menger, for example, wrote about margin, the best translations take about 5 or 6 words, right? Which is, you know, the benefits and costs of satisfying some of this use of this concrete resource or something like that, right? And you can't say that, right? That's, you know, it's not like margin. It's not going to be misunderstood. It's just not going to be understood at all, right? So this is a tricky one, right? It's sort of finding words like next or you know, or something like that that communicate the idea. But it's tricky, and we just have to be careful who we're talking to when we start to use that term margin.
Right, because it can, so like when Steve says on the margin, I'd rather have lunch with you than anybody else, right? That it takes a while to translate that out of economics and into an actual compliment, right? So,
Right, or the reverse, right? So I'm busy, I can't have lunch with her. You know, she'd never do this. Imagine she says, so you don't love me, right? And my answer would be, well, not on the margin, right? Because I have other things I have to do right now, right? See, and you know,
economics and dating is a whole other
that's a whole talk.
Yeah,
Yeah, right, but so you can see how that term can be easily used. So those are the vocabulary was a real stumbling block, but it sort of suggested there were other stumbling blocks too. We talked a little bit about numbers and graphs already, right? That's the idea. If you have math phobia, right, it's going to be difficult to sort of open up to hearing of what economics has to contribute. And when we talk from gains from trade in just a minute, we'll talk about how you can get around that. Okay?
But I think sticking with the numbers and graphs for a minute, I think it's more than math phobia. It's a question of not speaking the language. Right, so I was saying to someone earlier that like my Hebrew is good enough to say good morning, and thank you, and to like pray, and occasionally actually read little bits of the prayer book, but mostly I just have things memorized, right? So if I had been asked to talk to you guys this evening in Hebrew, it would have been extremely brief and largely incomprehensible. I mean, my math is better than that, but not when it's the level of math that you guys do, right? So confronted with calculus, I may as well be confronted with a Hebrew newspaper. I got nothing. I don't even know where to start with it. I do look at it and understand that for the people who are using it, it is the most efficient and effective way to communicate the stuff that needs to be communicated. But it is absolutely not going to communicate anything to me other than this is not something that I can understand.
And certainly I know from teaching that students in intro struggle with graphs too, for the same reason. They just, really after 7, 8, 9 weeks, you should have your demand curve sloping down and your supply curve sloping up, but something is blocking some number of students from getting this pretty basic idea, and it's about that style of communication.
Right, the other, my favorite economist sin. When I started working at Liberty Fund and started drinking with economists, I said to many of them, I said, you guys have the best stories. You've got these great stories about, environmental regulation that does exactly the opposite of what you want it to do. These great stories about government regulation that sets out to help the poor and it just makes things worse. You've got these great stories, you've got these great stories. How come I never hear them? Right, I hear them when we're sitting around and drinking, but why isn't this like all over the news? Why isn't there a movie about like saving the elephants, right, through free markets in Africa? There should be a movie about that, like with Meryl Streep. It should be amazing, right? And there isn't. So what's the problem? And the problem is that often, I think two things happen. When economists want to communicate their great stories, either they hand people a bunch of data and charts and say, go read my data, come back when you're convinced, right? It's a fairly common move. Or they start with a counterintuitive when they tell the story. So, and I think this is something that comes from teaching. This is a great way to
Right,
that.
it comes from teaching. It also comes from, that's a great way to get published, right? If you have a story that is counterintuitive, even including counterintuitive to economists,
Right.
then you've got something.
So, if an economist wants to tell you about free market environmentalist stuff, they will begin the conversation by saying, if you want to save the elephants, you have to shoot more elephants, right? This guarantees that any kind of green person or environmentalist in the room is going to stop listening to you, possibly slap you and walk away. Right? But economists love to start stuff that, because you guys are like, wait, I don't know, tell me you're looking really interested. Tell me about the elephant. They opened up honey.
Just want to shoot them, I don't care.
I just want to give you some example that I used in a kind of debate with an environmentalist. I say you need to thank the oil companies every day that save the whales.
Right.
Since we use the oil and so on, and how come and so
Right.
on.
Right, good,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
The problem is economists start there and people stop listening.
yeah.
Boom, they're done. They're not interested, right?
The
If
people
you
who
flip
start
it
listening
around,
to that, the people are already sold up. You cannot convince them anyway.
well,
There
if
aren't
you
people
flip
you can't
it, if you
convince.
flip it,
Yes, that's true.
there are some people you can't convince, but if you flip it, right, and if you say, we both really care about the elephants, and we want there to be more elephants, and let me tell you this great story about how Nairobi increased its elephant population by whatever the heck percent it is over time, or let me tell you this great story about how we have more whales now than we've had for however long it is, or any of these.
America has more forest than any time since,
Right, since the founding, right. So if you flip the narrative, you start with the stuff you agree on, you get them to nod at the first couple of paragraphs, right? Then you say, let me tell you how we made that happen. And you save your counterintuitive for the end, right? So after they've nodded and they've followed along, you say, so you can see that what we did was save the elephants by shooting.
well, allowing people to
Allowing people to shoot the elephants, right? Or we saved whales by promoting the oil companies and by not using whale. And then all of a sudden, you can at least have a conversation, right?
There's
and
a better chance.
There's a better chance that they've heard more of the story. And you probably haven't gotten smacked, right? Which, is a good step in the right direction.
You made the world greener by promoting paper and
Right, that's what I got, yeah, that's right. If
The
paper
industry of
becomes a
paper.
resource, you gotta grow trees to have paper, right? Yeah, exactly, right.
Right.
So again, but it's about how you frame those explanations with skeptical audiences that we're really talking about here.
Right, the argument, the facts of the argument are no different, right? They don't change, and they shouldn't change, right? Because they're correct, and they're persuasive, and they're really important, but the way that you tell them to people, the way that you communicate them, you can flip those 180 degrees and hang on to a whole lot more of your audience, I think.
So there's a bunch of other issues that are stumbling blocks, and we kind of get into them. One is that word, what word? Capitalism. Right? And that word is, I think these days, a huge stumbling block, because when we use it and when the left uses it, we mean, I think, two different things much of the time, right? So one of the questions we need to think about when it becomes a stumbling block is, what do people mean by capitalism? And are there better words that we might want to use for the purposes of communicating with that group? And not, there's an interesting question of whether capitalism is the best word to describe that system. Put that aside for the moment, at least within the context of debating with people for whom that word means something like anything that's in the interest of capital is capitalism. So, crony capitalism is capitalism, right? Foreign adventurism, that's all capitalism. Why? Because some capitalists benefit from it, right? So that, all of those kind of things, and we're like, no, that's not capitalism, right? But even the word itself, the etymology of the word suggests ism, a belief in capital, right? So that it makes it even sound like the beneficiaries from that system are the owners of capital. It really, of course, should be called consumerism, right? Because the ultimate beneficiaries are all of us as consumers.
Yeah, but people don't like that either.
Right, for a bunch of reasons. Notice, by the way, socialism works the same way, right? Socialism suggests that the beneficiaries from that system will be society as a whole. Well, we know better than that, right? In fact, if anything, socialism is better described as capitalism, or at least the powerful, and capitalism is better described with the word socialism, because the benefits are largely to society as a whole. But we're not going to extract ourselves from 100+ years of those terms. So I do think when we talk with people who aren't economists, who are, who have sort of left-wing views, it's really important to clarify that word or come up with a different word. I think free market has some advantages to it, but there's problems with that too. Freed market with a D on the end is helpful, but problems with that too. So again, I'm not sure what the right answer is here, but you got to at least communicate what that end goal is. And
What is dear?
Dear cause means tested
innovation.
means tested innovation, yes. Market tested innovation. Right, market tested innovation. I want to add one word to that just to make it really roll off the tongue. Right, market tested permissionless innovation is what I would call it. Right, that it's not just that there's innovation, and it's not just that it's tested by profit and loss, but that anyone can try things and then have them tested by profit and loss. But yeah, so there's a bunch
Looks
of
terrible on a
yeah,
poster.
I know. So again, I think there's no really good answer here. Or we can be Hayekians. It's the Cadillac sequence. That, right? So I love Hayek. Don't get me wrong, but that's not rolling off the tongue either.
Not solved by a simple system of natural liberty.
Right? Yeah. There's all kinds of things we do.
So I think that outside of the United States, there's an advantage because liberalism doesn't have the
Yes.
doesn't have
Right. And that is probably the better word. My friends in Camden have the Institute for Liberal Studies. It's Matt and Janet Buffton, and they have been very conscious about using. They very intentionally use that word and about using.
Well, outside of, but then we get neoliberalism, right? Which is another. So we sort of lost that word.
So now we're calling it classical.
I think classical liberalism is
Is
fine.
that a smart thing to connect between an ideology, doesn't matter what's named, to the field of economics?
So I think here it's about. It's going to be inevitable that if you're trying to persuade someone else about the value of economics, right, that you're going to end up talking about markets or free markets or
But there are many occasions when the ideology of capitalism, or whatever you call it, it's not consistent with the economics.
Right.
Sometimes, not always. I'm not saying always.
No, I know, I get it. And it depends on the issue. It also depends on who your conversation partners are, right? Whether they will bring this. So aren't you just defending capitalism? Okay, well, what do you mean by capitalism, right? And then you've got to have that conversation. So yeah, I'm not suggesting necessarily that we lead with this point.
Because if I'm coming as an economist, it's not my ideology, it's research. We discovered some stuff.
And agreed.
Empirically.
Agreed, but the other side may not, right? And so I think you just have to be prepared to deal with that question of what it is you're talking about when they bring it up.
I just read a podcast on that, but I think that to make this distinction, we can say whatever goal we want to push forward, you need resources to push it forward, whatever ideology you have. And free market is the best way to give your resources.
Right.
And I just heard a podcast that how North Korea funds itself
Right.
Yeah.
with a free market system that they do is some of this, and that's the way they fund their weapon program. So you can fund whatever you want. You have to free the markets.
Right.
Right.
Scandinavian countries are a good example, where their markets are they get score higher on economic freedom indices than the U.S. does, and enables them to afford a larger welfare state. Right. So yeah, these are all in play here. Let me sort of make one other quick point, which is we both write for Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and I think there's a certain advantage in one of the aspects of that approach, which is foregrounding the least well off, right? That when we talk about economic issues, if it's something where we're changing this policy will help the least well off, that should be right up front. And it's along Sarah's point about counterintuitives, right? Get to the things you agree on first. Yes, we all want to help poor people become richer. Okay, how do we do that? Well, let's look at these policies, right, that deliver on those ends. I mean, Deirdre McCloskey is a good example of doing this.
Yeah.
And I think also focusing on interventions that getting rid of interventions that favor the rich and harm the poor, right? The more we do with rent seeking and public choice and sort of talk about how wealthy people use the state to enhance their own wealth at the expense of others, and conversely, right, how those policies, those rent seeking, whatever policies, harm the poor, that's a good, you can get agreement on those things with people who are skeptical about economics. You're talking about power, right, and you're agreeing with them on the way that capitalists can manipulate outcomes for themselves. But notice, right, now we're not on a free market anymore, we're about the ability to use the state to do this. And I think that's another important aspect of how to have these conversations. It's often a stumbling block, I think, that people perceive economics as serving the needs of the rich,
Yes.
right? Or economic arguments and policies as serving free market policies as serving the needs of the rich. Let's focus on the ones that don't, right? The ones that harm the poor, and realize that it's not about markets, it's about the intervention. That would be helpful too. So that's all the problems.
Right. Now on to the good stuff. So the gains from trade here that come from taking this approach, or that come from hanging out with folks in other departments, working on other stuff, or the sort of interdisciplinary tactics of groups. And I know that Tקווה works not just in economics, but also in theology and the humanities and some other areas as well, correct? And so the reason that kind of cross-pollination of ideas is useful is, first of all, you get a much wider audience for your ideas, right? You bring in all of the people like me who think that free market, it might be fine or whatever, but that's for economists to talk about, and we have other things that we care about that are more important, like Shakespeare or whatever that we're currently worrying about. So it brings in all of those folks, which is enormously important, right? Outreach matters enormously, especially if you're trying to do policy work, if you're trying to move voters, or if you're just trying to change the popular conversation on an issue.
And within an academic setting and a policy setting, you can, if you start to think carefully about these issues, you can bring on board communication specialists, and you can make free market ideas more respectful to those who've been more skeptical.
I
was rushing to the end of the sentence. Right? So it becomes a way to think about, how do we do this well? How do we do this better? How do we reach those audiences that we haven't reached?
And also, it lets economists learn things. For example, there's that age-old question of why aren't we persuading people, right? We've got the data, we've got the facts, right? The free market is winning. Right. As the gentleman who introduced us says, obviously it's won, the Soviets lost, right? Free market won. How come everybody still hates the free market, right? What's the problem? A lot of it is communication problem. Right? So a lot of that can be solved, or at least can be begun to be solved and begun to be attacked by finding new and better ways, different ways to tell the same stories, but to tell them better, and to tell them more effectively to different people. And
economists are, as Sarah said earlier, we have great stories. We really do. We're just not great storytellers, and we can be better at it, right? we've been.
Right. Comparative advantage too, right? You can certainly learn to tell your own stories better, but also you can find people who care about some of the same things that you do, find ways to talk to them, and they can help you tell the stories better.
And humanities scholars can learn some things too from that.
Surely not.
Yup, believe it or not. And they might find tools that are useful with their own disciplines, within their own disciplines. The best example is for me, I think for Sarah would agree, is public choice, right? Public choice opens up whole new ways of interpreting history, of interpreting literature, and that sort of gives scholars in those disciplines a set of tools they haven't had before. And in doing so, makes economic arguments and free market arguments that much more sort of plausible, or at least they're willing to listen, because this tool makes sense to them, right? That way of thinking about the political process.
Right, so is House of Cards over here?
Both.
Yeah, okay, House of Cards, right? Great thing for opening up discussions about public choice theory, right? I mean, if you're interested in talking about, or showing people, giving people examples of rent-seeking,
government failure, largely, yeah.
You name it, it's all in House of Cards, right? It's right there. And that's a work of art, right? That's an artistic creation that a lot of people in humanities departments are super interested in talking about. It's a very powerful work of art. And a great way to talk about the kind of politics that intrigues and worries all of us.
So, we're going to give you two quick examples, and I think we're ready to get up to, no, we're okay, we're about 45. Two quick examples of things that we've sort of done that sort of illustrate some of the things we've been talking about. So a number of years ago, I teach a course on the economics of gender and the family. One of the things I do is sort of talk about the history of sort of household income and what that's meant for women's labor force participation and all these kind of interesting things. And Sarah, heard about this, and then she came across a book called Roundabout a Pound a Week. And this is a book that was published in 1913 or 14 by a group of women, Fabian socialists, who were faced with the claim that poor people are poor because they don't know how to manage their money, right? That's what people were saying. So what these women did was to actually go into these homes in a working class neighborhood in London and get all this data on expenses and income, right? The roundabout a pound a week was their income, right? And expenses and income and how they did things, and produce this little volume that's just full of interesting stories. And you know what their conclusion was? Do you know, in fact, why poor people don't live well? Because they're poor. Shocking, I know, but it's because they're poor. And the idea was they simply can't meet all of their, sort of all their expenses very easily, right, on around about a pound a week. And so
the budget's too
tight, right? So I have used this in class with students where I ask them, after we talk about some other data, right? They read bits of this book, and I have them do an exercise. I call it the grim calculus, right? And I put them in groups, and I have them I give them the prices from the book, and I say, here's your income, here's your expenditures, what are you going to do? And then I give them a whole series of changes in that scenario. You have another kid, what are you going to do? Right? And they're like, can we sell the kid? Right? So,
how young can the kids go to work?
Right? How young do they have to go to work? Right? Which are in fact not off in terms of the questions folks were asking 100 or 150 years ago. And so it's a really useful exercise where they're encountering. This is not a work of fiction, right? But it's not a work of economics per se either. It's sort of this historical document, right? And it gets them in the place of these people, and it's a really valuable work.
And more importantly, it's a work that economists just don't know about.
Nobody, I've never found an economist other than me who knew about this.
Now a bunch of them do, because we jump up and down and tell them all about it, but nobody had heard of this book. And so it's a useful and important resource. The one I want to talk about is, so probably shortly after that, right around the same time as the Roundabout a Pound a Week book, when I called Steve and told him about that, I called him probably a couple of weeks later and I said, hey, listen, Horowitz, I have a question for you. I have 2 erotic poems about coinage in the 17th century. I think they're probably really economically interesting, but I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of stuff. Would you read them and tell me what's in here? Would you translate for me? And Steve went, you had me at erotic poetry.
Yeah.
I'm in. And so we wrote a paper together about these two incredibly odd little 17th century poems that certainly no economist had read.
Nope.
Most English
And they read a lot of erotica, but not that.
Yeah.
17th century erotic poems about
What
money.
about coinage? You know, one of them is by a reasonably well-known to 17th century scholars anyway, poet, and the other is just a broadside verse, and people hadn't put them together before and hadn't talked about them. And I think in large part because most literature professors don't have an economist on speed dial to call them up and say, hey, would you tell me what is going on here that I don't get and that I don't understand? Right? And so the impulse would be to talk about other parts of the poem or to just walk away and do something else entirely, right? And so the ability to understand the parts of the economics that I could understand and then have the sense that there had to be more here and somewhere to follow up with the question was enormously useful.
And you can find that in the Journal of Private Enterprise in 2014, maybe something.
Yeah.
Like that. Anyways, and it was a lot of fun to work on, right? Because I got to use my background as a monetary economist, but to deal with a very different kind of, not a data set, right, and not an economic sort of argument per
my
se,
kind of data set.
right? Not a numerical data set, right? But these works of poetry, right, which is really different and really fun, and it, it's something that Sarah can share with lit people and say, no one's ever thought about these poems this way before, right? And this is interesting, and I can share with econ people and say, look at all the interesting economics in these poems about coinage and recoinage and all this stuff.
Yeah, but the other fun thing about this, the earlier stuff in particular, is economists, bless your hearts, are prone to think that, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and before that it's sort of this dark time in which no one really understood economics or thought about it very much. And then Adam Smith appeared and light was created and we all went on from there, right? And so it's really nice when you have poems from like 1598, right? Where people are talking about bad money driving out good money, right? And talking about what happens when you call in all the currency because it becomes so unstable that you have to call it back in and kind of just recoin everything. Just hit the reset button on an entire economy, right? Fascinating. And there's a sophisticated level of economic, a relatively sophisticated level of economic understanding in these poems that are meant for a general readership that I think, for the most part, people think didn't exist that early. So
if what we really care about is sort of getting people to think like economists, right? The economic way of thinking. Because we think that is helpful in getting people to appreciate the virtues of markets, right? We need to lower the barriers to entry, economists do, and show how it applies to, again, the everyday products of culture, show how economics applies to all these other policy things we're talking about, and how economics can be a tool to attack privilege, to attack folks who, the crony capitalists, and a tool, flip the other way, and a tool of resistance to the extent that economic ideas, free markets in particular, can show how, that we can show using free markets how best to help the poor, right, and those who are perceived, rightly or wrongly, as victims. That's a way to engage, I think, in a broader set of conversations.
right, and it doesn't mean changing the ideas, and it doesn't mean getting new data, and it doesn't mean altering the, people sometimes think that when we give this talk, we're talking about spinning economics to make it like more, spinning the free market to make it more palatable to the left or something. It's not about that. It's not changing anything about what the core of this is about. It's about how to start a conversation with people from other disciplines or people who don't have any economic understanding without changing the ideas, but just finding a way to get them to listen long enough.
And I think this is a useful way of thinking about a lot of things in the policy world, because often you're talking to members of the Knesset, for example, who either are inclined to disagree with you or don't know much. And also, if you think about the op-ed project and sort of that level of reaching the broader public, same sort of thing, right? So how do you begin those conversations in ways that make them more productive, and how do you continue them in ways that will get people to keep listening? And with that, we'll stop and take questions. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. We answered everything.
We did.
All the problems have been
Because
solved.
we're awesome.
You want to know what the poems?
Ah!
It's in the paper. So, there's two really. Should we do wait? Punching?
I knew
More
this
fun.
is you.
So, okay, so the one that's the most fun to talk about, because it's a little naughty, is that at all of the currency gets, the Elizabethans call in the coinage
Right.
all of the time. It's always going bad, it's always getting completely corrupted. There's a ton of counterfeiting in the 16th century. People are cutting off the edges of their coins to get, until, you know, it gets down to just about nothing. Which is why a lot of coins have the milling on the edges, those little
It's hard to
on the edges.
shape.
They're doing something called salting, where you carry a lot of your silver coins together in a little leather pouch and you shake them. And if you do this, if you have a lot of time on your hands, and you shake them for long enough, silver dust comes out. And if you do it often enough, you get, you know, enough silver to take to the
Right.
silversmith.
And economists, by the way, knew of these ways of debasing the currency. Right?
Right.
This is essentially inflation, right? By passing it the coin at its face value, even though its metallic value did not match its face
Right.
value.
And there's a lot of foreign currency making it in through trade, and nobody really knows from day to day what it should actually be worth, and it's all very complicated. So at various points during the 16th century, they call in the coinage and reissue it. So Elizabeth does this at one point and just reissues all new coins. At a later point, they call in all the coinage, or they, instead of calling it all into the mint, they say everybody has to take their coins, whatever you've got in your pockets, whatever you've got buried under the floorboards, take it to your local silversmith or goldsmith, who will weigh it. And if the coin is valid, he'll punch a hole in the middle, right? And if the coin is valid, you know, presumably
And,
we
and,
get.
and it doesn't lose any value, right? Because you put an
Yeah,
hole
you
through
don't-
it, it pops out the other side, right?
Yeah.
So you don't remove that hole, you just push it out the other side. So it weighs the same, but now
So, right, so the broadside, I feel like my mother is standing over my
I know.
shoulder going, I can't believe you're gonna talk about this. So the joke in the broadside is a bunch of women standing around saying, this is great news. Did you hear? The government says everybody gets to get punched this year, right? And it's gonna, you know, you get to get a hole punched in you, and it's gonna increase your value rather than decreasing your value, right? It's gonna make you a greater worth, to improve your valuable, right? And who are you gonna get to punch you? And it's this whole like long discussion about whether it's gonna be the blacksmith or whatever, right? The point is, right, yes, it's very funny, right? The point though, aside from the joke, which is very good, is that this actually requires a fairly impressive level of understanding what it means to call in the coinage, right? What it means to, why they're punching holes in, the preservation of value. It's pretty impressive, and this is a broadside ballad, right? So this is what passed for like watching, I don't know, David Letterman, or is that a cultural?
or Daily Show. Like,
Yeah, some sort of like late night news. It would have been a song people sang in the streets. It would have been posted up on billboards for people to read. They would have read it out in taverns, that kind of thing. So this is not high culture, right? This is the lowest of low culture. And the idea that an economic joke that complicated is disseminated to the culture at large is pretty impressive that early. So that's one of the 2 points. The other one's much longer and
a little less
funny.
A little
So.
less funny. Was that, yeah.
I have a question. I have a feeling our brains it's like we're the same humans that we used to be like 20,000 years ago when we used to live in a cave. I heard somebody talking about like the hardware is the same, the software is getting new.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
So our instincts are against economics.
Yep.
We think the family,
Yep.
the family in a cave, and we are talking here about macroeconomics. So I like to talk with people about economics, but my feeling is that when you talk about the masses or when you're trying to sell economics, the best way to sell them is that we don't know nothing. And it's like when you open, you know, those coffee machines in the streets that you pay money.
Mhm.
So after you see what's inside, you don't want to buy it anymore. So as long as you don't know, yeah, I trust the coffee machine is doing a great job. But and you know, there's this Hayek, when he got the
Right,
Nobel
right.
Prize, he was talking about the pretense of knowledge of economists. So I like to listen, we don't know nothing. And everything I will try to fix, it won't work, it will squeak, it won't be even efficient. Even the word efficient is actually it's even deeper, the word efficient. The definition of the efficiency is a very minimal definition.
Yeah.
So what I like, listen, we don't know what we're doing, don't trust government. They just don't know. Even if we think we know, our logic is not good enough for that. And better trust yourself about your money.
So I think I agree with that in general, right?
That's actually a conservative.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I would phrase it exactly the way you did, that we don't know anything. Because I do think even for Hayek, we know some things. We can make what he called pattern predictions, and we can talk about some larger questions.
And distributed knowledge.
Yeah, right. And so I think, right, and we can talk about the way markets enable us with our limited knowledge to still collaborate, cooperate by giving us a way to share it. So I think that's those. But the general tenor of humility, right, is correct. We need to be really humble as economists. And I think that also is a more effective communicative strategy, right? We don't have all the answers. We don't know which buttons to push, right? And we're not, we may be experts, but our expertise doesn't entitle us to power, right? The other part, I'll go back to the first part of what you're saying, which is I do think actually one of the biggest challenges for liberals, right, not just economics, but more broadly, is the point Hayek makes about the distinction between the anonymous and intimate orders, right? Which is your sort of that evolutionary psychology point, right? Our brains, our hardware, right, is set to think in terms of intimate orders of family and kin, right? And that leads to sort of an instinct for altruism, an instinct for redistribution, right? All those sorts of things, because that's the world we've lived as humans for most of our existence. Modernity, this idea of living in a world where we have to figure out how to cooperate with anonymous others, right? How do we learn to deal with strangers? It is very counterintuitive, right? And now, it's true we have changed, the software is evolving in some ways, but we're still always pushing back against those what Hayek would call our moral instincts.
We also tend to think that because we can plan for the intimate order
We cannot.
fairly well, right? I mean,
Especially not in democracy, because usually it's
Right.
politics.
But we think because we can plan for our families,
For our own
right?
households, right, our own lives.
I can plan dinner, right?
Right, and I can create a budget and figure out who should get what, and I can decide which of my children needs what thing, right? And maybe it's not equal, right? Because I can figure all that out. Right?
And we think because that works pretty well on a family level that we ought to just be able to, all of the comparisons with, you got to think about the government budget, just like you think about your household budget. That is the least good way to think about the government budget.
The family of man, right?
Yeah.
But in a debate framework, it's totally true, but in a debate framework, when someone goes and say, we don't know anything, the other guy, I know.
Right.
I know what to solve your problems.
Yeah, he might not know anything.
So they vote for you,
Yeah.
not for that guy.
Right. Well, right. And
That's where the stories are the best, because the stories show how many people knew stuff, and eventually...
Right.
Yeah, but to prove it, not knowledge,
I think
it's much harder than to prove
but
knowledge.
look, if you have those stories, you do know something, right? So that's why I wouldn't want to lead with the.
Well, I know how much I don't. I understand that I don't know nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is again very Hayekian humble liberalism. I like it. But if I'm in a debate framework, I'm not going to lead with that, right? I'm good. That might be my response when someone comes up with a detailed policy proposal. I might start talking about unintended consequences and how do you know are good questions to ask. But if I know enough to ask those questions, I know something important, right? And if I've got a story about how this sort of thing failed for this sort of reason, again, I've got a story.
Also, we are proposing an institutional framework, right?
Right.
We're talking about property and specific
Right.
actual thing.
I was talking about what
But it's minimal.
Simcha said, that the moment we say, I don't know, or myself, if I'm trying to persuade people or push policy or whatever, they will say, okay, I will find someone who does.
No, you don't say I don't know. You say we don't know.
Yes.
I'm
No, you
one
can
of
say
the
like
best
that.
economists in the world, and I can tell you that I'm one of the best.
Yes.
But we know very little.
Right.
Yes, but I'm not. If I don't want to hear the answer, okay, I will find someone who does
Yeah.
know something about it. So
Yeah,
it's always a struggle to circumvent our lack of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And,
That's the rhetorical challenge, is to recognize that we, right, and include economists in that. We don't know anything. Not sure which way I want to put it, right? But we everything. But we as economists do know some things, right? A small number that are often negatives, like don't do this or that's going to cause this kind of unintended consequence. But even Hayek talked about the idea of pattern predictions, right? That we can make those, right? So I think it's a hard balancing act to pull off to sort of think about how you rightfully recognize and discuss our ignorance, but at the same time not go so far as to say we can't even help because we don't know anything. Tough.
You had your hand up.
I apologize, I came a bit late, so it could be that I'll say something that was said already, but it wasn't here. So just 2 points which that with the people that do what we do deal with is one of them is that one of the challenges that you face is that usually the people that promote free markets are also, in America, for example, are also conservative, or, for example, also libertarian. It depends on the... In Israel, you can say they're also either libertarian or right-wingers, it's not conservative. So the problem that arises from that is that it's very difficult to separate, because in order to argue effectively for free markets, you need to be able to separate, in my opinion, you need to be able to separate libertarian ideology and conservative ideology from the topic of free markets. That's one issue. The second issue. The second issue is, when you spoke about terms, I think one term you didn't mention, what you thought about it, was economic freedom, because you spoke about free markets and about capitalism. You failed to mention that one, so what are your thoughts about that term? And I think another point is that a very effective argument, this is just a tip for people from my perspective, a very effective argument in order to convince people from the other side is talking about regulation and bureaucracy, because regulation and bureaucracy are universally hated by everyone. So it doesn't matter if you're in the state, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a conservative, you're universally hated by everyone. So sometimes it's better not to even go into the conversation, like about free markets, yes or no, but just to deal with those topics which are universally hated.
Yep.
Yeah.
One last note, I'm sorry, it's a lot of stuff. 1 second. Lost my train of thought.
How about we answer those two? And then
Okay, I'll remember it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the political connections of free markets, I think this is one of these cases where the flipping the narrative that we were talking about, I can't remember if you were sitting there or not when we were talking about flipping the narrative over and suggesting, start with the things that people agree on, like everybody hates regulation, so let's talk about that. Like, wouldn't it be great if you could get an Uber in Israel, anywhere, ever? We all want to help the poor, right? We all want, we all want better education for our children. Whatever we're going to start with, you start with the thing that people can nod to and agree with, and then you get into the, the policy details or the economic argument that you're going to make. They may still not agree with your economic argument at the end, but at least they've kept listening to you for longer than if you lead with an economic argument or a political argument that they already know before they even hear it that they're going to disagree with it, right? So I think starting with a point of agreement is crucial for that stuff. And I agree with you that as much as you can, right? I get the impression it's sort of impossible in Israel to leave politics out of anything ever, but as much, and it's increasingly impossible in the United States too. So
because if you look at who funds like organizations in the states that promote free markets, so you get to the Koch brothers and et cetera, then it's impossible to have a discussion.
Right, and so just leaving that, leaving that stuff to the side and not, talking about the end goals, right? Start by talking about the end goals that are shared in common. get to the means, and then let other people worry about the politics, right? And then if they get to calling you, part of the coctopus or whatever, you just,
I think another piece of advice here is to pick your battles, right? I mean, as I say to young libertarian students, it's not the goal of every conversation you have with one of your lefty fellow students to turn them into an anarcho-capitalist after an hour. One, it's not going to succeed. Two, the next person who talks to them is going to turn them into a Nazi, right, or a socialist, or whatever, right? So no, pick issues where you think you can be effective, and it's always a long-term project of educating people and moving people. So let's not worry about the politics. Let's find the issues we can find some agreement on and push forward in those ways. I did want to address the economic freedom and that one. I think that's a great term, by the way. I have no problem with economic freedom. The other one that I think is effective, and from survey data, at least young Americans are like this term, is free enterprise. Now, it's easy for me to say that since it's in the title of my position at Cal State, all right? But even before, I promise, even before, right? I thought this is a good term to use, right? And so, in a culture where young people are, entrepreneurship and startups, and right, all this is really cool, right? That okay, that's free enterprise. You have permissionless innovation, right? So these kind of terms I think are really helpful. Economic freedom I think is better than a lot of the others, but worth thinking about too.
Right. I remembered what I forgot. Thank you for your answers. Another main issue is academia. No, it's
Best answer ever.
Okay, so you have the same problem.
So, as we know, it's no secret, academia is completely on the left. The economics department is a little bit better, but not even. So, again, in my experience, the art in that specific problem is to be able to produce also, I would say, academically robust arguments. There's no other way to deal with it. I mean, the problem is so big that the only way to solve it is just to be able to bring academics that are big names and research and etc. that supports free market claims, and it's getting more and more difficult, and not the opposite.
Right. So, a couple comments on that. I suspect Israel is a little bit worse than the United States in a number of ways. At least in the U.S. right now, economics departments are not nearly as bad as they are in Israel from what I know. Okay, so that's one thing. And in the United States, we do have foundations who are supporting centers and institutes and so on, like the one I'm affiliated with, whose explicit goal is to teach. Careful how I say this.
Yes.
To teach about, in my case, entrepreneurship and free enterprise, right? And that if you hire the right people for that job, right, you end up having these strong voices for free markets on campus. And I think there's now the Koch Foundation has funded over 200 programs, not all big centers, but 200 programs at 200 different institutions in the United States. So that's a good sign. That said, all the problems are still there. So one of the challenges is, how do you communicate, how do you succeed in academia, how do you persuade people? So I'm going to, after 27 years at a liberal arts college with lefty colleagues, many of whom are my dear, dear friends, and let me just tell you a couple anecdotes here. So I was at St. Lawrence University for 27 years. While I was there, I served as an associate dean for 6 years, as department chair for 6 years. I had a named chair there that I was voted to by my colleagues, right, by a majority vote of my colleagues. If I had wanted to, I could have been the dean of the whole place. So I must have done something right, because there's no secret about my views, right? That I was out of the closet from day one, right? So how do we explain that, right? And here's my, I don't want to be too self-congratulatory, but I think here's things I learned, right? Number one, don't argue in bad faith. Don't accuse your interlocutors of bad faith. They're good people. I know them. They're my friends. They're great teachers. They're just wrong, right? They're just wrong. They're not stupid. They're not evil. They're just wrong, right? So engaging them that way, right, and sort of giving them things, helping them understand public choice, for example, and how it might help their own work, or pointing philosophers to the best work by libertarian philosophers that might be relevant to the courses they teach, right? That you're being helpful, right? You're not saying, look, I'm not saying, I'm going to say content, you don't have to you do with it what you want, right? But I think this book would be really interesting for the course that you're working on, right? I had a speaker series that for 8 or 9 years, brought in lots of outside speakers. I had people from other departments show up for particular things. And most important is exactly what you said, which is you have to do, free market liberals have to do excellent scholarly work, and they have to be really good teachers, right? We have to have impeccable records that will get us tenure and promotion, and that will lead people to vote us into a chair or want us to be associate dean or whatever it is, right? If any of you know the old American TV show MASH, right? And I call this Hawkeye Pierce syndrome, right? Alan Alda's character was an outstanding doctor, which is what enabled him to get away with all his shenanigans, because they couldn't afford to kick him out because he was saving all the patients, right? And so I think as a strategy for liberals and free market types, right, you got to go into your job in academia thinking, I'm just going to be the best damn economist I can be and the best teacher I can be. And if I'm all those things, nobody's going to mess with me, right? Because they don't want to lose me because they know that I care about the place and I care about the things they do. For me, that's the story of my experience at St. Lawrence. It might have been that I had exceptionally tolerant colleagues. I think there is some truth to that. And one advantage of teaching-oriented places is being an ideologue in the classroom, like many on the left do, is really bad pedagogy. It just makes you a terrible teacher. And most students don't want to hear it. Last point, not because I think I've done this talk so many times. One other quick thing. The problem on the left is not that they are treating right-wing students unfairly, though sometimes they do. The problem on the left is they don't expose all of their students to the best arguments that conservatives and libertarians have. And they're too easy on the students who agree with them. So you get these left-wing students who don't know anything about the ideas that we care about. And so when the speaker comes to campus, right, we have all this sort of outrage. Like take Charles Murray, for example, who I don't agree with, but he's a legit scholar, legit scholar. And if you've never been confronted by those ideas before in a serious way, you've only had them caricatured by your faculty. You're an intellectual lightweight as a student. You don't have any heft, right? And so I think that's another strategy to work on is how do we get our left-wing colleagues to help to expose students to the best ideas on the other side.
Right. It also helps to be a nice person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Don't be a lunch tax.
Right. You gotta do your time on committees. Right. You gotta pitch in. You gotta help. You gotta cover your colleagues' classes when they're going to be gone.
Yep.
You have to be, especially if you're someone who the department doesn't agree with.
Yep.
You have to be nicer than the people they do agree with. You just got to do it. You have to be friendly. You have to be the good guy. Right. There are. Names need not be named, certainly, but I'm sure we can all think of a few folks on our side of things who make a profession out of being disagreeable, right? Out of being the guy who's always got to come in and throw the bomb in the middle of the discussion table, or has to, always be contrary, or is rude because it's shocking and sort of adorable or whatever. Don't be that guy.
That's usually guys.
Yeah, it is. Sorry, but. Especially right starting out, certainly, but nobody needs to be that guy, and it doesn't. Even the people who do that, who are very, very smart and very, very well respected, I don't think it does our arguments any good for people to say, oh, really smart, complete jerk, so rude, right? It's just not. It's not okay.
Thank you.
So in Israel today we have two hot issues. Yesterday the Knesset voted for raising the minimum wage, and a couple of weeks before they decided to raise the transfer payment for disabled. So how would you treat these subjects without being considered the bad guy?
Right. So
doesn't have
all right. I'll take the easier one first, which is minimum wage. Right? The history of minimum wage laws in the United States, at least in other places like South Africa too, were pushed by whites to keep either blacks out of the job market or to keep immigrants out of the job market. I mean,
or
women, or Jews, or women, right, out of the job market. So in the United States, unions have a long history of wanting to see minimum wage. One, it helps them economically because it makes low wage competition less effective. But they also, the unions in the 30s and 40s, this was about keeping out the Jews and the Irish, and earlier than that, the Chinese, and earlier than that, right? I mean, the origins of minimum wage are completely racist and xenophobic. So you got to be careful with this, right? Because you don't want to come across as saying all you members of the Knesset who voted for this are racist, right? But one way to do it is say, look, you guys, I know your heart's in the right place. All right, but you got to understand that the progressives 100 years ago agreed with the arguments of the critics of minimum wage today in saying it would hurt all those groups, and they liked it. That was a feature, not a bug, right? So whatever your own views are, you're adopting an argument that both your own predecessors and economists today understand as hurting the least well-off and hurting these groups. So that, for me, I mean, there's plenty of evidence on minimum wage, right?
And there's evidence too that the racist origins and the sort of construction of it have continued through modern use of minimum wage laws, right? So the people most affected or most negatively affected by a rise in the minimum wage in the United States are young African American men, right?
Exactly.
And that's because minimum wage is an engine built to keep young African American men out of work.
Young low wage, young low wage.
Out of work, right?
Basically say,
I'd like
don't try to make them agree with you. Just let them understand what they're talking about, and let it
let it sink in.
I just like to relate it because by coincidence I gave an interview this morning on Jerusalem Radio to Avi Ratzon about the minimum wage. But I would say that it's very much depend on the media that you are communicating. I wouldn't start with historical argument when you have few seconds on radio or television or something like that, because you lose everybody, especially when nobody aware to the issue at all. And so I would say that you need to build a hierarchy of importance of arguments.
Right.
So
and I would start, if I was doing a radio interview, I would start with what Sarah just said, which is we know from the empirical studies what the impact is.
And this is basically what I did, and I said, well, everybody mean well and there is no opposition and so on, but there is side that nobody noticed, and let's see it, and then refer to the
cutting off the lower rungs of the ladder.
Yeah, exactly.
We need the most efficient term, fast term. Because
I also interviewed
empirically, there are some, I'm not talking they are good empirical, but there are empirical real researchers who got, there's this viscosity of wages, I don't know. And they say, no, it doesn't actually happen, only the margins,
Right, and you can acknowledge some of that, right? That you can say, look, we're not saying there's going to be massive unemployment, but whatever unemployment there is depends on how big the increase is, and it's going to be disproportionately on those groups. I don't want to lose. One quick thing. Our friend, the philosopher David Schmitz has a great line about hearts being in the right place. And David says, if you think the most important thing is that your heart is in the right place, it isn't. All right. So, but you got to start with that, right? So on the other one, the transfer payment loans. Okay, these are harder, and I think how do you do without being a bad guy? I don't know the empirical data in Israel well enough, but I'd want to look and see. It was for the disabled, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
only 20% of the disabled are working.
Only 100. Only 20%.
20%. So 14 the OECD.
Right. So here's how I think I might go. What?
It's going to be less.
Yeah. Right. That they're going to have bigger problems with minimum wage if you can connect the two arguments. Right. So double duty on the disabled. Here's how I might go at that in like a radio interview. I might say something like the following. We know that people respond to incentives, and we know that people on the left believe that because that's why they want to increase the tax on soda, right? Or all these, or increase the tax on gasoline because it'll pay. You're right. So So what are the incentives this creates for disabled folks? It creates an incentive to not do at least what they can do given their disability to join the labor market. In the United States, and I'm sure, I mean, this is a tech country, right? One of the things that's happened over the last 30 years is that more and more jobs are open to people with disabilities because they don't require, if they're physical disabilities, they don't require the physical strength anymore, right? And that we see a lot of folks with physical disabilities in the US working in retail or sometimes in technology because they can work around those things, right? And I think it's a way to go after this is to say these are or can be very valuable members of society. If we want to treat them with dignity, right, what we should be focused on is how do we connect them up, what sort of institutions do we have that can connect them up with labor markets to see what kinds of jobs they can have. If we continue to raise the benefits for them, we're making them, I mean, whatever language you want to use, that wards of the state, right, in a way that undermines their dignity and hurts us all because they could be contributing in positive ways, right, if we can figure out, if we can have a better way of figuring out what kinds of jobs they can do where their disabilities will be, not a problem or a minor problem. Again, I don't know the gory details here, but that's the kind of
In Israel, we had also an interesting twist to the whole story because the two stories came together and there is a conflict between them. Right. Since you raise the minimum wage, the disabled that need assistance now cannot afford it.
Right.
So it's there was an outcry from the other side as well.
But that's why I think the disabled question you have to go after by sort of what does their structure of human capital look like? Can we improve it? Cutting them a check's not going to do that. How do we improve it, and how do we get better matching in the labor market for the kinds of jobs that are there? So if you're concerned about the disabled, and if it's inevitable you're going to spend money on it anyway, at least do it in a better way, which seems to me to be focused on the human capital and the matching questions.
I just want to say something. I wanted to ask a very similar question, take the same two examples, but I was going in a different direction. I was going to take these two examples as examples of things maybe we shouldn't even touch. Just to go to your point before, that at the end of the day, all of these theoretical discussions are nice, but people discuss current events, and we have to decide which events we want to respond to, which we don't want to respond to, and which we want to create. For example, there has been, I see Yoni here, he's been a part of the campaign to bring Uber to Israel, right? That's an amazing campaign. It's been very, very effective, and so maybe we should focus on energy, on issues that we know where we have the upper hand, and the other ones even, I personally think that Netanyahu made that decision politically. He said minimum wage I'm not going to deal with because I know it's a battle I'm going to lose, so I'm going to let them, because he's a capitalist, right? So I'm going to let them raise the minimum wage. I'm going to deal with other issues which are more important. Maybe I'm wrong on that, I don't know, but that's my interpretation. But I mean, that idea of choosing your battle, I think, is something that's very important also.
Agreed, and I think that's going to depend a lot upon the empirical estimates of the empirical impact of those other kinds of, all the things you might work on, and then the politics, right? If there's really no way, I mean, I think it's important for free market type think tanks to at least make their views known on these things and to establish a reputation as sort of having a position and having a humane position on them. But how much energy you want to spend on it, good question. And it's probably the case that allowing Uber would do more for poor people, both as drivers and customers, right, than the damage done by the minimum wage. I say that tentatively. I'm not sure if I believe it, but it's an interesting claim.
Well, if I may disagree, I think this room has about half of all the people in Israel that write about free market.
It's funny because everybody who we've talked to about free markets in Israel is like, there's only like 4 of us, but we keep meeting more.
I have a point about it. Yes, it's a very, very small group. And if we won't talk about minimum wage, no one will. If we forfeit every battle, although I'm more on the political side, usually, and as someone who pushes policy, I think, okay, I won't deal with it. But as people who write about it and talk about it and discuss these issues, all issues concerning liberty, if we won't do it, no one will. We cannot forfeit anything. At least let our views know. I write something small about minimum wage, okay, 90% I will write about fiscal policy, 1% I will say something about minimum wage or about disabilities, because if we won't write about it, no one will. We're a very, very small group.
I actually agree with what you just said, and I just like in this conversation, something that came out is that I think that's why it's important to have a lot of different people, because there's going to be the bad guy that speaks about minimum wage, and there's going to be the politician that doesn't speak about minimum wage, gets elected, and actually advances policy. You understand? That's why you need all of the people that are in this room.
You have to calculate the cost of talking about.
But you need effective communicators, right? You need someone who has thought carefully about how am I going to respond to those two questions in a 2-minute radio interview, right?
Without having everyone who's listening go on.
What kind of
Sure, yeah, what kind of an person.
Right, so, and again, this has been something I think free market libertarian think tanks have gotten better at over time, is understanding their own talent and understanding who's good at what sorts of things. One of the differences in the US is that people from Cato, for example, are on TV all of the time, right? And that's, I mean, I was on CNN a month and a half ago. Wait, you think you had it bad defending minimum wage? I had 5 minutes on CNN to defend price gouging. So, no, I don't want to hear about it.
You should have seen the hate mail.
You should have seen the hate mail. I had one voicemail that said, I just saw you on CNN, you're evil, I hope you and your family die of Ebola. So there's some not nice people out there, right? But I think your point's well taken. I think we have to take the hard cases. How much in the way of our total resources we devote to the hard cases versus something like Uber, which is, I think that's exactly the right strategy. Push on that, because when people, you've got a constituency presumably who would like to have it, and when you guys can claim some responsibility for making it happen, that's a big win.
Oh yeah, when you get, I mean, you get the hipsters in Tel Aviv in line with Uber, I assume that they're all over wanting it, right?
Anyway, just for your knowledge, there is a kind of experimental Uber service that's trying to go around the regulation in Israel, and during the weekend you can enjoy it. So you can, from the evening of tomorrow, you may use it for the weekend. So.
Does anyone know how?
They don't advertise.
No, I don't think we'll actually have a rental car Friday and Saturday, so I think we'll be okay. But the cab, we've been taking music get today, relying on our tour guide and translator. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Sometimes we are talking to people, and civil service in Israel is becoming larger and larger. So sometimes you're talking to someone who actually has a position, he has a job, he's feeding off the government. I'm sure that you probably talked with people in this position. What your angle on this would be interesting.
One quick thing, never blame them, right? They are part of a system that doesn't work, right? So we see this, too many libertarians, public school teachers are evil. Stop, right? We understand that it's a problem with the system of public schools, right? Or government employees are all evil, right? So I think my general advice is don't make them look like the bad guy, right? Talk about the policies.
Some of them are.
What?
Some of them are.
Yeah, some of them
but still, even if they are.
You're right.
Usually they are victims.
Right, we know they are, right? But I think again, don't lead with that. Assume they're one. I mean, if you really know you know the person, you know in fact they're one of the bad guys. Okay, you can push that a little bit. But I think you just have to assume that they are in some sense victims too, being caught in this machinery that causes problems.
Most of them are. It's the truth.
And I'd probably start by saying, look, I know that you work at the Department of Redundancy Department, and I know that no one knows better than you do how hard it is to get stuff done here, right? And you know how much gets in the way of you doing your very important job efficiently and well, right? And then from there you can kind of move into general problems with regulation and so on. Nobody's going to know better. If you can get them talking, nobody knows the problems with the system better than the people who are trying to work within it, whether or not you think they should be working within it at all.
And they generally think you can
My
reform it.
wife
from
is a
within.
teacher and is a very large part of the public service.
Yeah.
And I keep telling her and her colleagues that I want them to earn more.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's why, and to be more professional
Right.
and to have better conditions.
Right.
And that's why I want to privatize
Right.
the
Yep.
education
Yep.
system.
We'll still need teachers in that system, right?
And we love you.
Yeah, right, right. But we want to make it easier for you to do your job and not stifle you with, I think that we're right about 8:15, about 90 minutes. So thank you all very much. These were great questions, great discussion, and I hope it was useful for you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
I think